Thanks be to God.
A lesson from the letter of James. Every generous act of giving, with every perfect gift, is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. In fulfillment of his own purpose, he gave us birth by the word of truth, so that we would become a kind of first fruits of his creatures. You must understand this, my beloved. Let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, for your anger does not produce God's righteousness. Therefore, rid yourselves of all sordidness and rank growth of wickedness, and welcome with meekness the implanted word that has the power to save your souls. But be doers of the word, and not merely hearers who deceive themselves. For if any are hearers of the word and not doers, they are like those who look at themselves in a mirror. For they look at themselves and, on going away, immediately forget what they were like. But those who look into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and persevere, being not hearers who forget, but doers who act, they will be blessed in their doing. If any think they are religious and do not bridle their tongues, but deceive their hearts, their religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God, the Father, is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
Now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything for the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" He said to them, "Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition.'" Then he called the crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Well, did that list of bad intentions make you feel guilty enough? That's what a lot of people think the Bible is all about, telling us how bad we are. And it certainly does let us know what our possibilities are. I would like to think that it does have a more positive side. And I also want to assure those of you that in the Episcopal Church we actually read from the Bible. I am going to read 2 verses from the Bible in this sermon, so don't be shocked. we have not the most positive reputation sometimes. Anyway. Well, today we're hearing about laws, statutes, ordinances, precepts, teachings, all this kind of stuff. Things that we are told to do and not to do. And there's clearly some kind of price tag attached if we do them wrong or don't do them at all or whatever. And they're repeated throughout the Bible. But especially In the Hebrew scriptures, they are in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. Those are the books of the law, but they're elsewhere. And yeah, we're told a lot of stuff here. Some of this is religious. Some of this is kind of moral and ethical, like be nice to your neighbor, that kind of stuff. And some of it is civil kinds of laws, things that we would put in a law code from the civil authorities rather than religious authorities. But they're all lumped together here because there's no difference between religious and spiritual authority. This has been going on, you can start with Adam and Eve, and they were told to do things that they obviously didn't do. They did things they were told not to do. That's right. Well, let me offer you, this is the actual Bible reading that we're going to do. I wanted to give you some examples of how these things are very different and really kind of cover the waterfront. In the book of Exodus, there's a section called the Book of the Covenant, which is kind of some basic laws. Some of these are very civil, money-based. What happens when something goes wrong? How do you make up for it? Well, you pay money. This is from Exodus 22:28. And this is what happens if you happen to own an ox, and it has horns, and it gores someone. Okay? So it gets out of its, whatever it lives in, its pasture, its pen, and here we go. When an ox gores a man or a woman, because there were different laws sometimes for men and women, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten. But the owner of the ox shall not be liable. So if you don't know that you have a mean animal, and it goes and attacks someone, you lose the animal, and of course you lose all that meat, because an ox was a big animal, and it would have fed a lot of people for quite a while. They tended to eat sheep and goats, so this is a big loss. But you cannot eat it because it's defiled, it's done something bad. But you're okay because you didn't know it was going to do anything bad. Next verse. If the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned but has not restrained it, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner shall also be put to death. So you better be careful about your animals. Are any of you familiar with the insurance precept with a dog, one free bite? Yeah, if you have a dog, and you have homeowner's insurance, and your dog bites someone, they will pay the damages for one bite. But at that point, the dog is off of your policy, and any more bites, you're on your own. So that's kind of what's going on here. The ox gets one free gore, and that's it. After that, you're in trouble. Actually, I shouldn't say that, because if the ox gores someone, it does get stoned, but you at least survive. So they were a little stricter than our insurance companies, which I have to say is kind of hard to imagine. Anyway, so that's an example of one type of law that we have, all mixed up with lots of other kinds of laws. In Leviticus, there is a section called the Holiness Code, and it talks, among other things, about how you, thank you, it's raining, how you are holy before God. What makes people clean and unclean, what makes, like the pots and the cups and the kettles and things. That's all, that kind of stuff is all in there. Interestingly, if you're a man and a family member dies, it has regulations about your ability to mourn. It was customary back in those days to shave your head and your eyebrows and pour dust on yourself and wear cruddy clothes and sackcloth. So it has a list of people for whom you can do this. But the person who is not included is the man's wife. You cannot mourn, obviously, your wife. Fascinating. I have the reference if you're interested. That was a surprise to me. Another section of this same of the book in Leviticus talks about how the garments for priests, because they have the high priest and they have the other priests, and they did all sorts of things in the sanctuary. And in this is Exodus. Chapter 28, verse 42. Priests may not go commando. That may seem weird. I think it's quite weird. But anyway, that's prohibited. So just so you know. We can talk about this afterwards. Okay, so there are just tons and tons of laws and regulations and suggestions, and you better do this, you better not do this, and examples and stuff like that. There are also, of course, the Ten Commandments. There's just a whole bunch of stuff here. What they have in common is instructions or advice from God about how we can live in and take care of and enjoy the creation that God has given us. That we ourselves are worthy, and everything around us is worthy. We just need to take care of it. Although some of these regulations may be a little odd, most of them are not terribly harmful. It's recognizing that God is in all of us and in everything, and saying, here are ways to remember that and to preserve that, so you don't forget and treat something like it's worthless, because nothing is worthless. So that hasn't changed. This is still God's creation. We are God's people. That's the same. But our culture has changed, has it not, from 3,000 years ago? I have to say that in this community, I did say, how many of you have oxen? And there are people who have cattle here. So this is not like, a city congregation. We do have rural areas. Many people have sheep and goats and all that stuff. But most of us cannot really relate to an ox that gores someone. We're more likely to relate to a dog that fights. So we need some updating, just in the examples. Not that it changes the meaning, right? So in Leviticus, there is a rule that you cannot mix linen and cotton together when you're making a garment. Well, okay, fine, I'm unlikely to do that. This is polyester, maybe a little cotton. There's no polyester in the Bible. So we have to kind of extrapolate. I don't know what you're supposed to do with polyester. I think this has some cotton in it too, so that might not be a good idea, but, and I can tell you, this is not wash and wear. You have to iron this thing. So I would be happy to have something that didn't need ironing. Anyway. So we can look at these commandments. As I said, I think their goal is to keep us mindful of the fact that everything comes from God, and it's good, and we can enjoy it, and we can share it. Sometimes we tend to use these commandments as judgment. We can judge people for not following commandments we think are important, not following them the right way. That is something I imagine I certainly do. Let me just leave it at that. It's a very human thing to do. And it's something that we need to stop doing, and we just keep trying. Okay? And you can also interpret these, as I have been saying, as life-giving, as positive. And I have examples of both of these. The first one, this is the judgment, what I perceive as judgment. I have a friend who had been raised as a Mennonite. Mennonites, I have been told, are Amish with electricity. So, yeah, that came from a Mennonite. They read the Bible very literally, and so, anyway, he grew up in the Mennonite community. He became a Mennonite pastor, and he loved it. And along the way, he got married, and at some point, his wife decided that she had had enough. So she left him for someone else and divorced him. It wasn't his idea, but this is what happened. Well, his community, his church, said, Jesus says that no one can be divorced, period. So you have to go. You cannot be our pastor because you are divorced. Even though it was not his idea, he wasn't doing anything wrong, as far as I know. That was it. And he could never work in that community again. No place would hire him. Even other religions that were similar, but not exactly Mennonite. He was done. He had to find another job in a different field. And he was heartbroken. This was years, I met him years after this had happened. He had remarried, and the whole thing. I don't think he wanted his first wife to leave. He certainly didn't want to stop being a pastor, and it was awful. So that, to me, from an Episcopal perspective, I would classify that as being somewhat judgmental. A more positive example of living into spirituality or religion here was when I visited a friend's grandparents. She's my best friend from high school. And her grandparents were Orthodox Jewish. And they lived in a very Orthodox neighborhood in Brooklyn. And we arrived on a Saturday evening. We arrived after dark, because you're not supposed to travel on the Sabbath. So even though we obviously had been traveling, we at least waited until it was dark. And it was about a week before Passover. And they welcomed us. You know, of course, they were thrilled to see her, their granddaughter. And they were very nice to me. They were very accommodating and welcoming. And they're in an Orthodox house. You don't mix meat and milk products. You eat them separately. So their kitchen was completely divided. There was one side that had a refrigerator, a sink, and a stove. The other side had a refrigerator, a sink, and a stove. And one was meat and one was milk. And when you eat on the table, you have either a different table or you have different tablecloths. So they were very comfortable with this. This was a really important part of their life. So we sat down and had a snack, and the meat tablecloth was there. So her grandfather just rolled it back, and underneath was the milk tablecloth. So that's where we had our snack, because it was milk. And after that, he just rolled the other one back. And so they had managed to come to terms with part of their religion. And they didn't make me feel guilty for not knowing. They just explained things to me, and if I did something, the worst thing I did was someone had given me some cookies. And because it was the week before Passover, that's when they got rid of all leavened things. And I think I must have brought the cookies out, and they were fine. They didn't care. But their daughter, who lived upstairs with their 5 children, I blew a gasket. How could you bring this into the house? It's right before Passover. So I took it out. But it wasn't her grandparents who said anything. It was someone who was a little more judgmental. So anyway, the house was not contaminated. We were fine. But I felt that by these people who had come from Hungary in the 30s, before they got killed, they're such nice people, and they really enjoyed telling me what they were doing, and they welcomed me into it. They didn't judge me. The daughter was another story, but it was a really nice experience, and I think of them in a very loving way. That they shared the positive things about their religion with me. So I think that when we follow God's laws, we do it because it creates good. It keeps us in the goodness of creation that God has given us. But Jesus points out, sure, we have all these laws, but do we really follow them with our hearts? Or do we just do them mechanically, without thinking and living into it, and letting it light up our world and our lives? I think the Pharisees that he was talking to were being judgmental of him and his group, and that's probably why he didn't follow any of the traditions, because he wanted to annoy them, so that they would start thinking. But as he says, the heart, which we think of as the place of love and life, can also be more like a sewer. Right? And that's not what it's designed to be. So Jesus says, you need to pay attention. You need to think about this stuff. And for us, we need examples, contemporary examples. I mean, he was there sitting and watching people wash stuff and not wash stuff, and that was what was happening. For us, we would have to go into a Jewish home to have an experience, and that's probably a little harder for us than if we were Jewish. But I had this brainwave about a situation that might have something to do with judgment and the nature of God in a person. Do any of you watch the TV show Undercover Boss? Yeah, you know what it is? Yeah. It's a boss, usually, let's just say a man, because those are the episodes I've watched, who is in charge of a big company, doesn't know any of the people who do the day-to-day jobs, and who disguises himself and goes and works with them. Usually he's an abject failure at doing their jobs. He might be good being a CEO, but he cannot, sweep the floors or things like that. And he spends time with them, and then after a week or so, he meets with them and says, "Oh, by the way, I'm the CEO." And they all go, now what happens in this case is really interesting. And the show has been criticized for having these CEOs be too nice to their people, which is kind of interesting. He often will, certainly rewards people who are doing a good job, and very rarely is someone fired. It does happen, but it's pretty rare. But a lot of times he talks to people who have got 3 kids in college and they have no money, somebody needs a car, there's all sorts of needs, somebody's working 2 jobs and has no time with their families, all these kinds of things that happen to all of us. And then when you don't have enough money to handle situations like no car or all these kids in college, then bad things happen. A kid doesn't go to college. Somebody loses a job. So these CEOs will give money, cars, whatever, to help people. It's not just random, like throwing money in the air. It's generosity. And they've been criticized for being too generous on a sort of random basis. But it's not random. God gives us everything we need, including spiders. God gives us everything we want when we have God in our hearts and when we are living the meaning of these commandments, the spirit of the commandments. God is unbelievably generous. Whenever we have oh my gosh, I can't believe the right person came along, or this happened, or that happened, it is no accident. It's God wanting to give us what we need. So let's think of God as an undercover boss. When Jesus comes down looking like a person with us. I like that idea of God. Not a nasty, mean, judgmental God, but a loving God. See, if God is loving, why are we here? Amen. And we do read from the Bible in the Episcopal Church. We criticize for being too generous on a sort of random basis, but it's not random. And this is the... Oh! It's a spider! It's behind you. It's right there. Sorry, can I see it? Okay, you just watch it, okay? It's up to you. It's a big spider. I know it's a creature of God, but it needs to be, yes, it needs to be observed. Anyway. Okay, back to, yeah, see, spiders, that's on purpose. I just don't know what. Anyway, God gives us everything.